Welcome back, Dr. Gunder. We are so happy to have you again. Let's go ahead and kick it off.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I see some friendly faces that were here at my last talk on building a sustainable culture of quality and equity in digital learning environments. I welcome you back warmly. And if you're joining anew or you're actually just watching back this recording, I'm so happy to be here. I'm Angela Gunder. I'm the Chief Academic Officer for the Online Learning Consortium, which is a global nonprofit that assists educators with supporting the design, delivery, and continuous improvement of quality online, blended, and digital courses. Mouthful. But all of this to say, I am honored to be with all of you today. So before entering into any conversations about quality and equity in digital learning environments, it's really important for us to individually recognize what each of us uniquely brings to a space, and both the challenges and the affordances of our identities within different contexts. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. My father is Black and my mother is Brazilian and Sicilian. I'm a cisgender woman born in the United States to college educated parents. I worked as a designer I've been a designer for almost 20 years now. I've focused on instructional design in fully online environments for the past decade. Including for the Office of Digital Learning at the University of Arizona. That was my previous job before I moved over to the OLC. And in my current role as the CAO of the OLC, I support our Institute for Professional Development, global events, community engagement, our research center, strategic partnerships, consulting, and our grants initiatives. So a big portfolio, a lot of amazing humans, but really trying to help folks answer some of those big questions and challenges that we have around how do we protect and maintain access to education. Outside of my job at the OLC, I teach instructional design. I also teach game design for the School of Information at the University of Arizona. And I've been teaching online for almost 15 years now, which is crazy to say. I'm also a lifelong learner. I just finished my PhD last December, actually finished it in October and then got the piece of paper in December. I was one of those pandemic graduates, and my research was on the dimensions of power and privilege within open educational practices, and more specifically within the ways that people remix open educational resources. And I give you all of this backstory because all of these facets of my identity provide context to the work that I do, as well as the communities that I participate in. And they serve as a reminder of what has and has not afforded me privileges and power that others around me may or may not have. And I carry this with me in my teaching. I honor the identities of those around me, particularly my students. And today I honor each and every one of you for sharing this space with me, including the joys and the struggles and the wisdom that you carry in this moment. With great humility, I also honor the original stewards of the ancestral territories of the Salt River Valley, and that the care that the Akimal, Odham, and the Pipash peoples provided for these lands has allowed me to be here within these spaces. And I just want to take a moment again to pause and honor the original stewards of the respective ancestral lands where each of us stands. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned earlier, this time together bears weight because of the collective knowledge and experiences present not only in this moment in time, but also as continued engagement with the ideas and extensions that we will share in the future. And with the recording of this talk and the activities being held in open spaces for continued collaboration, we actually give life to our ongoing connections. If you leave with nothing else but just the idea that you can bend space and time in your roles as educators, I want you to leave feeling empowered in that way, that you can think about how you deliver instruction in digital learning environments to create greater connection, not less connection. So just keep in mind that this talk is a living thing that you can come back to and participate in at any time. that the talk is given meaning by our collective collaborations, not just what I'll share with you, and that we impart this meaning multimodally in a digitally mediated environment that respects all types of contributors. So if you choose to share videos, to use, colors to annotate, all of that is welcome and accepted and important in how we make meaning and understand. So it would be wasteful for me to not utilize the unique affordances of this online space to support this talk as living beyond this moment in time, as collaborative and as multimodal. So I'll be asking you to engage in any and hopefully all of the following ways throughout the talk. And in fact, if you want to just jump in while I'm sharing, I love that Zoom has added the little emoji icon in the chat. My latest passion has been asking people, hey, what emoji represents how you're feeling right now, in this day and time and in this moment. Typically, I don't feel like this in this moment, but typically this is the one that I use, which is this sort of person surrounded in fog. That typically tends to be where I'm situated, but use the chat to ask questions, provide ideas, challenges, extensions, as generously as you feel comfortable. And right now, yes, as Jules has done, oh, Jules put my spirit animal up there of an octopus. Go ahead and click on that little, that smiley face that's in there and share what emoji. Oh, Ali, you have some words to say. I feel like that quite often too. We're going to share some stories and reflections and examples when prompted in any way that you choose. And then we're going to use these materials to continue the conversation beyond this time with and others. And Angela, if you're on an old version of the Zoom app, A-OK, when we get to the collaborative Google Doc, you can drop in an emoji of your choosing into there so we can see how you are doing. All right. So I'd like to kick us off by sharing a short story with you all. After a work trip in China in 2019, I was fortunate to spend a few days in Tokyo with family and friends. I'd never been to Japan before. I'd never been to Tokyo before. And on my last day there, I set off to visit the world's first digital art museum by a group called Team Labs. And on the train ride there, my husband grew ill and he had to leave suddenly. And he was concerned because he thought that, because he wasn't feeling well, that I wouldn't go with him. But he begged me to still go, or I wouldn't go without him, but he begged me to still go because it was an immersive experience. It was right up my alley and I'd really been longing to enjoy the space. So I went reluctantly by myself. When I got there, I had to pack all of my belongings into a locker, including my shoes and my wallet and my passport. And I entered the exhibit all on my own. So what you see here is a picture that I took of the inside of the museum, and it consisted of different digital experiences that were connected by these dark hallways and barely illuminated paths. And I was one of very few non-Japanese speakers that were there, and moving through the space made me feel ashamed that I hadn't taken the time to learn not only the language, but how to connect with the people around me and navigate the space better. And as I shared in the previous talk, my mom was a language educator for her entire career. So I've always espoused the importance of learning language as a way to connect and communicate, and far more than just transactional experiences. And in that moment, I was like, I should have listened to mom and done a little better before I had gone to the museum. So one of the early rooms in the exhibit was called Soft Black Hole, and it required you to traverse a space where the floor was basically a 4-foot deep foam mattress. And every time you took a step, you displaced all the people that were around you. And if you had no one to lean on like I did, you found yourself struggling and falling while those around you moved forward. The shot that you can see here is just one person walking through the room, but imagine that this room has tons of people not only moving through, but lying down. And, if you're an outsider and you're isolated, you could easily feel what I felt at the moment, where I questioned whether I should have come in the first place. And I was in the middle of the room. I didn't even know how I'd get out of the space. I didn't even know how I could even exit and have the opportunity to leave. Months later, years later, at this point, couldn't shake that experience. And at the onset of the pandemic, this memory took new meaning. I watched the entire world, and I know you all did too, collectively enter into foreign spaces with little light to guide the way. And it haunted me. And I knew that so many students and educators alike were being thrust into new teaching and learning environments without the time, the resources, and even that hand to sort of help them through. They didn't feel like they had the support or even the autonomy and the agency to make it through, or to even get out as they barely move forward. So I want to flip this around to all of you. I think about all of you and your experiences navigating digital learning environments in new and strange and challenging ways. And I'd like for us to collectively take a minute to reflect and write about these experiences in the collaborative document that I've created for us. So I've got a link I'm going to drop into the chat, and my friends, Jules and Enoch, will definitely help if anybody needs help accessing this as well. You're going to join me on this document, and I see y'all. Hey, everybody. I love when you're in Google and you see everybody pop up. This document has some foregrounding of what it means and how we'll work together. But if you want to scroll through and jump into page 5, there's an activity that says surfacing isolating elements across digital learning environments. And I have 2 questions for you to answer. One is, how have you felt less empowered in the past couple of years? And where have you struggled? And you can be as authentic as you'd like to be. I mean, this is a public space. You can be anonymous. I've had some folks be pretty candid. I've had other folks sort of allude to things that are going on, however you feel safe enough to contribute. And then that second question, how have your students felt less empowered? Where have they struggled? And some of the things that you might share might be things that existed before the pandemic, might not have been, created at the onset of the pandemic or even accelerated through the pandemic, but want to give you a little bit of time to do that. All right, thank you for your contributions. Thank you to Stevie Wonder for providing a little bit of a backdrop for these incredibly profound and generous contributions that you've made to the document. I'm struck by the responses. I've done this activity in a lot of different formats and contexts. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, it was very much about how people were starting to feel isolated and were wondering how they would forge connections. And it's a very different moment now where we're looking to repay or pay back or fill up the well of good reserve that has been depleted over time. And I think in some ways, and you'll always hear me think about challenges as opportunities. If this opens up a space for us to talk more about life-work balance, if it opens up a space for us to talk more about mental health and the care that we need to have for our colleagues, but more importantly for ourselves, I truly have faith and hope that we'll be able to turn a corner in some of these ways, but we do so by first being authentic and sharing the challenges that are in front of us, which is very, very hard. Storytelling, narrative, and really sharing our own unique experiences not only help us to feel less alone, but also create opportunities for us to see where we can do better. And, as evidenced by all of you, we need to do better. Jumping into, just some examples that I've seen within the OLC. I've worked in service to challenges that have prevented countless learners from around the globe access online education equitably. I didn't know that was going to be my job when I started this job in December of 2019. But it has certainly become a different thing than what any of us thought. And I want to share 3 specific challenges that me and my colleagues have researched, with the spoiler for all of you that none of these barriers were new to teaching and learning due to the pandemic. So one of the big ones is just that working at a nonprofit with the mission to ensure access to quality online and blended learning in both the US and internationally, reminds me on a daily basis that power and privilege continue to dictate the magnitude of challenges across different contexts. And some of this was even brought up in your comments, like comments about adjunct faculty and, how you're not necessarily given the resources and the same space and placement as other folks within the institution, or certain students that, are basically failed by us because of our systemic failures to address underfunding and lack of infrastructure to support the institutions, particularly institutions that are serving Black, Latinx, Indigenous, first generation, poverty affected students, particularly our students in rural areas, our students that might be in two-year colleges, vocational, career and technical centers of education, but certainly at all institutional types. We have these students at every institutional type, and it's not just well-resourced institutions that are not seeing these systemic failures. We see these failures at macro and micro levels, from individual students attempting to persevere through classes using Wi-Fi in the parking lots of universities and restaurants, students even struggling with actively participating in classes that might require that they keep their cameras on. I've had conversations with folks that have said, yeah, I have students that are literally taking classes from mobile phones within homeless shelters, and have been penalized for not being able to jump into Zoom and to be on Zoom, and feel great embarrassment and shame at turning their cameras on. And then thinking at sort of the macro level of some of the work that we're doing within entire countries within sub-Saharan Africa and within South America, that have come to us looking for some solution instead of the only option that they feel that they have, which is to close entire countries' systems of school for whole semesters. And there are even some schools that have not reopened since the onset of the pandemic, which is baffling to think. We had a summit of HBCU leaders back in 2020, and Dr. Carl Pettis, who's the provost of Alabama State University, shared that for far too long, the narrative has been that many HBCU responses to securing critical resources and funding are not strong enough. And, when we think about answering some of these systematic failures and how quite often it's just that, yeah, we don't have the resources, or the resources won't be given. He called for all of us to look at dedicated efforts to change the narrative, that if we are to reach our intended goals to impact students and our HBCU communities, we need to push up against these false narratives that have run pervasive around how we resource and fund the work that we need to do, especially for so many institutions who've consistently struggled prior to the pandemic, not just at the onset of the pandemic. Talked a little bit about this in my last talk in terms of the difference between remote instruction and quality online teaching, but in the same way that a translation of language serves as an approximation of the original content, taking the experiences of the face-to-face environment and attempting to map them to digital environments in a one-to-one way creates a lot of barriers to access, understanding, and connection. And we've seen the world depend on time-specific applications of synchronous online engagement through tools like the one that we're using now, like Zoom, that has been a game changer in terms of creating access, but has also brought up issues of fatigue, limited access and bandwidth, and also feelings of anxiety and exclusion over determining safe and quiet spaces to log in and turn on cameras and microphones. And my colleague Karen Costa calls for centering care and digital learning that gives students choice over when and how they connect. At the beginning of the pandemic, she used a food metaphor that I really like to urge educators to think of synchronous time in a course as the ketchup and not the burger. You can use any condiment or sandwich combination that you'd like, but I think it's really helpful to sort of recontextualize the privilege that it is that we have to be in this moment in time. I want to acknowledge all the people that are watching this back. I want to acknowledge all of you for carving out the time for even being here. This is precious space. And it's important that we think very carefully about how we use it and how we're making sure that we're inclusive and welcoming of folks that are not afforded the luxury and the privilege of always being able to attend and be here and be present, and sort of changing our misconceptions of what presence means. So working with faculty or instructional designers who've been building and facilitating fully online courses, I mean, it's a really strong start to learning more about the differences between remote instruction that many of us have experienced and are experiencing due to the pandemic, as opposed to leveraging the unique affordances of online teaching and learning that spans both synchronous and asynchronous modes. And, you know, we're thinking about this in new and deeper ways. This came up in the first activity as well, looking at authentic assessments. How do we assess mastery? And how do we not always hit the easy button for things where, you know, we're told, hey, if you just have multiple choice exams and you have them be proctored, that's the way to go. But there are a lot more choices and options in order to be more inclusive, more equitable, and also avoid discriminatory practices that can exist in some of the instructional technology tools that exist out there. Most painfully, and I say this with a heavy heart because I've been in open education for quite some time, but even with myriad free and open resources offering evidence-based practices and professional learning on quality online instruction, many educators and students alike were not afforded the time or space to align the design and the facilitation of instruction on critical digital pedagogies. And additionally, a lot of the interventions that institutions provided in order to move people online were employed as short-term fixes in the hopes of returning to some sort of constructive normal. And I always push back on that word normal. I'm like, there is no normal. There's the reality that we're in, but not taking this moment in time to think about strategies that would serve as catalysts for necessary digital transformation that would protect and sustain access to equitable and inclusive education. So we are at the point of our next activity. And I want to highlight that, you know, as you would surmise, these barriers to access are not new and they are not unique, but they do tell a broad story of our collective struggle to ensure that teaching and learning is both equitable and centers care. And I want to take a moment for us to reflect on the individual framing of the barriers that we each experienced. So join me again in the collaborative document. I'm going to put the link in the chat again. And I watch, Enoch might beat me. Nope, didn't beat me that time. But if you scroll down, and this is on page 8, and thank you to Anonymous Ifrit. I don't even know what an Ifrit is. That's going to be my first Google search after this. Kudos if you know what an Ifrit is and you want to describe what type of animal that is in the chat. But I have 2 questions for you. What barriers have you had to mitigate specifically within the digital learning environments? And it says in the past year. I think that's a good form of focus because you've had a lot of different challenges, I think, over the course of the pandemic. And then let me know, was this barrier one that existed prior to the pandemic? You can probably guess what the answers tend to be when I guide people through this activity. I want to do a full mic drop to the comment that Jamie just put into the chat. There's this sort of sense, and I think it was accelerated by the pandemic, that we just need to keep trudging forward. We need to keep moving forward and not use this moment in time to sort of pause and say, are our methods really the best that they can be? Are they the most impactful? Are they aligned to the needs of the students that we have right now, not the students that we had a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? And even though some of these challenges that we have in front of us are insurmountable, or seem insurmountable, how can we, buck that sort of notion that we want to keep on doing things that in the ways that we've always been doing them? Certainly had a lot of time to reflect on the misconceptions that I've even had within my teaching experience. And I put a comment about that, connecting with students in the face-to-face versus the virtual environment. There were pieces of the teaching and learning experience that even in face-to-face with them seeing me and me feeling like they know me and them saying that they knew me, that there were affordances that were opened up in some of the digital spaces that allowed them to feel safe and to build trust in me, and in ways that were shocking and surprising to me. So I applaud that comment, about us maybe pausing and seeing the criticality in this moment of avoiding treating this like a conveyor belt, like an assembly line, and maybe stop a little bit, and say, what have we learned within this moment in time, but the challenges and the opportunities within this moment in time, with all of us entering into digital learning environments. What are the things that we want to keep and continue to carry with us? And what are the things that we want to pause and let go of, that we haven't felt like we've had the ability or the bandwidth to let go of before? So once again, thank you for your generous contributions here. I'm going to move into the heart of my talk now, which offers opportunities for building a culture of care and transformation within your teaching and learning context through the concept of digital learning praxis. So in all of my years of working as an instructional designer and an educator and a leader, I found that critical pedagogy around the forces of power and privilege have been helpful in not only identifying the systemic challenges that prevent access to education, but in really pushing back and formulating new and empowering practices that center care. And that's care for our students, care for ourselves as educators of all roles, and care for the inclusive spaces that we create for teaching and learning in any modality, face-to-face, online, caring for inclusion within those spaces. And digital learning praxis is one of these impactful methods for transforming learning environments into spaces for care. And I'll break down how this is defined across contexts now. So as I mentioned earlier in my talk, digital learning is the use of technology and teaching practices enabled by digital tools to enhance learning. Praxis is the act of applying or embodying a theory. And engaging in praxis often changes the environment around us, but ourselves as well within the process. So when we put these two things together, and when we apply our rich and storied understandings of digital learning as situated across diverse sociocultural contexts to the creation of and participation in online learning environments, we engage in digital learning praxis. We embody the space through our collective efforts, and that includes our students too, and the knowledge that we construct. And furthermore, that learning environment is unique to the goals, the challenges, the knowledge, and the unique lived-in experiences of all present within the space, especially the students themselves. And we're doing it right now. You jumping into that Google Doc, telling your story, we're collectively creating knowledge that is specific to this moment in time and born of your unique lived-in experiences. So though there are myriad approaches to employing digital learning praxis to support a culture of care and transformation, I want to highlight 3 specific dimensions that have been particularly impactful in my work and in my colleagues' work across the globe. And across each of these dimensions, I will talk about specific approaches, actions, and resources for using digital learning praxis as a lever for empowering students and educators within equity-minded online learning environments. And I'll just jump right into the first one, designing for humanized digital learning. So my colleague, Dr. Angela Gibson, has been, particularly during the pandemic, connecting her longstanding work in humanist theory and online learning environments to a series of reflections that have surfaced in convenings and social media. And, back in 2020, you may have seen the hashtag Maslow over Bloom or Maslow before Bloom, which refers to psychologist Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs as being critical to secure before learning can begin. And I would even say it's critical to secure for us as educators before we can engage in teaching and learning. And Bloom here references Benjamin Bloom and one of 3 taxonomies of learning that he created back in the 1950s. And his cognitive taxonomy is probably extremely familiar to many of you, in that it's applied to all levels of education and instructional design. And Dr. Gibson, along with countless educators navigating the challenges and barriers exacerbated by the pandemic, calls for us to consider how our teaching practices cannot run contrary to the needs of our students, and that unaddressed basic needs prevent each of us from attending to our learning. So when we design digital learning environments that are humanized, we acknowledge two important truths that I've sort of alluded to, but I will emphasize now, that when we enter into any learning space, we do not divest ourselves of our identities and our lived-in experiences. And when we enter our digital learning spaces, we do not divest ourselves from our humanity. What this looks like in practice is that we reflect, we design, and we facilitate learning experiences that center care. And some impactful practices to start with can include reflecting on the cultural responsiveness of your teaching and how you are honoring and including the cultures and lived experiences present amongst your students. You can examine the use of technology and systems within digital learning environments. I love to use a tool like the Peralta Equity Rubric, which was developed to help educators look at implicit bias, to look at representation, and student support in digitally mediated environments. And then I also, really encourage you to go back to the basics, go back to Randy Garrison and his team who created the Community of Inquiry Framework, which promotes the intentional design of learning spaces that connect cognitive presence with instructor presence and social presence. So any of those small or big challenges that you're facing right now, like how do I do this in an online environment? Or how do I make sure that this strategy or approach is right, or that this tool is going to be supportive of my students? You can use some of these measures and tools in order to help you get a barometer and a pulse check on where you're at and where you need to go. Thinking now about how we construct digital learning spaces that promote learner autonomy and agency, backwards design yet again provides a structure for us to create learning spaces with the end goal in mind. This is one of those hallmark practices that needs to be in everybody's tool deck, but you're creating alignment between your learning outcomes, your assessments, and your content. And backwards design becomes a way for us to ensure that equity is centered in the entire process. If you take a different approach and consider how the design process is changed, if you determine that one of your outcomes or goals is that the student can choose when and how they interact with the course content, their instructor, and each other. And if equitable access becomes the goal, then learning design moves to a place where students can engage independent of a specific modality or of only one pathway. And that pathway might be clear for some students, but completely obstructed and blocked for others. Lastly, I want you to consider what it means to remix your own teaching and learning practices to center learner autonomy and agency. So taking the things that work, that are going quite well, and thinking about how you might shift them, change them, expand them in order to be more inclusive for all learners. So two practices that have been compelling for me that have been one is making my syllabi open and annotatable. I actually put my syllabus in Google Docs, and it's one of the first activities that students can engage in. They can do so by name or anonymously, but it's become a way for building community, for the students to make meaning collectively and determine which practices will best support my students uniquely. You might have heard of this referred to as an interactive syllabus or a liquid syllabus. And one of the most important things that I put in there is that any changes to the syllabus are made to the benefit and to the support of the student, that nothing is punitive within the course. And I write little things that are, that are true of my values within the classroom, that I really do not care about points and grades as much as I care about their learning. And that I want to help to support them in that learning journey. I had students at the beginning of the pandemic that said, thank you for saying that. I've been so stressed going through all of the syllabi for all of my courses this semester. And just that moment of hearing an instructor talk to me in a different way about how they wanted to support me made my blood pressure go down a couple of points. Like that's what the student had said, and I had a moment immediately where I was sad. Because I was like, why is this an exception and not the rule? Why are we not having this moment to dialogue and to engage and to build trust in the relationship that we're forging? And something that, I think for many people becomes a stick that they use to sort of rule the classroom should actually be something that is supportive and generative and helpful. Another thing that I want to share with you, and I put the website on here, you'll have access to all of these slides and you can dig in. And for those of you that came into the talk early and heard me talking about Oregon Trail and the Oregon Trail card game that I created around the online learning process, that comes from a collaboration that several of my colleagues and I have explored for several years. And it's the concept of rooting digital course design around the notion of a student as an epic hero. So through course mapping tools, through games and other resources that we've created, we've pushed against the notion that the faculty leads the student along a path to an intended outcome, and shift it so that the student becomes the driver of the journey to a determined path, and the faculty becomes the support, the wise elder, if you will. And we use Joseph Campbell's monomyth as one of the tools that we've created to situate this idea of the student as an epic hero. It actually shifts the classroom in a way where when you map it to the online learning environment, the student is part of a constructivist, student-centered learning process. And these processes work in any modality. You know, what does it mean to empower a student to move forward as a hero? What does it mean for each module and the assessments that you have at the end of each module to sort of work as like a threshold guardian? And really the big thing that started me off on this journey was just the idea that what does it mean to have an online course that you want to progress level through level of, and Lauren, you kind of alluded to some of those same thoughts. I even thought about good books. Like when you're staying up late at night and you're reading a chapter of a book and you don't want to put it down because you really want to see what happens next. What would it mean for us to build that intrinsic motivation within our classes? So I might come back. Well, we don't have to do this on the, I'll give it a couple minutes. That's okay. I'm changing my mind mid-flight because I want to make sure we have enough time to do all the things that we do. This will be an express round. But I've shared some resources. I want you to share a teaching practice that your colleagues have been using, that you currently employ, or that folks could use to design their learning environment to be more equitable. And you can go ahead and drop in the practice. If there's a link to a website, you can put the link in there too. This will be quick. We're going to gamify this one as well. And I'll give you just a couple minutes here to write some ideas. Thank you for all of the ideas that you've shared. I love the shout out to escape rooms, fellow escape room builder here. Definitely a great way for you to rethink the teaching and learning experience. All right, so the end of this presentation, I'm going to focus on that transformation aspect and kind of broaden us out. We've talked about digital learning practices at the course level, and then looking more broadly, what are the practices that can guide us to creating sustainable and lasting digital transformation that ensures equity across space and time? And I share a definition here that's been really meaningful to me. Many digital transformation definitions focus on instructional technology alone, but this framing by Lancashire and Nobel invites us to broaden our perspective to the innovation and creativity that's fueled by leveraging the unique affordances of digital tools and spaces. So it's more about the people than the tools, which I think is an important shift. Advancing digital transformation through digital learning practice has been hallmark to my work in the past few years and has manifested in 4 specific ways that I want to highlight here around professional learning, research, storytelling, and collaboration. And many of these links are on that I'm going to reference are on that worksheet at the very bottom. So one is that my colleagues and I have created support and capacity for professional learning that's included a lot of free webinars, workshops, summits, and publications in this time. And we're doing a lot of work internationally within whole countries like Ghana and the Philippines to determine new pathways for institutional transformation. We've also released a lot of free playbooks on effective practices in online and blended learning from Every Learner Everywhere, from the network of which we are one of 12 associations that's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we're trying to dispel the myth that support resources are only available for some and not all. So rethinking the ways that we've been offering professional learning has been key. And I would say too, the biggest thing is that, we're trying to do less and less synchronously because we know that it's very costly and privileged, and we're trying to find ways to have people meet us where we're at. So it's one of the reasons why I'm happy that the team here is recording this talk and people can come back to it and watch it when they want to, and that we have a Google Doc that we can continue to reference and use. We're also engaging in critical research on infrastructural inequities and barriers, and we're working with ministries of education in the Middle East on the state of online learning in the MENAS region. We're working with WCET around how we can more holistically care for specific positions, including adjuncts, lecturers, and even grad students in many ways are connected to that sort of ecosystem. And then we've been working with the Data Research Center, which is led by Dr. Tanya Justin, on organizational leadership models and gaps in structure and process, as well as blended learning as one of the pathways to a more equitable future for us. And we have several reports and playbooks on all of these pieces. The report in particular on the adjunct study, as well as the two playbooks on blended learning, are all on the Every Learner Everywhere website, which I link at the within the Google Doc. We've also, I talked a little bit about Dr. Carl Pettis before. We've amplified narratives of resilience from the various communities who pushed back on endemic inequities and oppression. One of the biggest things that I speak out against is this notion that well-resourced institutions need to figure things out and then go to our minority serving institutions, our MSIs, our tribal colleges and universities, and our HBCUs and show them how things need to be done. The way that we enact this shift is we create amplification of the unique stories, the opportunities, and the successes of these communities and their work within digital transformation, as opposed to a deficit narrative that quite often happens. And one of the publications that we've done that's on the OLC website is a report called Stronger Together, that is the amplification of a lot of the voices of HBCU leaders right at the onset of the pandemic. And it's a good example of how storytelling and narrative can help create empowering tales of resilience and give us new inspiration for how we can move forward. And then lastly, we create space for critical and respectful dialogue within and across communities, exploring challenges to equitable digital transformation and aligning our actions to new opportunities. And of note, we held an event in December of 2020, and then a follow-up event on May of 2021 that was funded by the Gates Foundation. It was called OLC Ideate. And we were gathering educators on creating a charter of action for ensuring a more equitable digital learning space. And the community is an open community, so you can actually go into the course. It still exists. I shouldn't call it a course, but it did have kind of a course component to it, but part course, part collaboration, part community of practice. So before I conclude, I want to leave you with just a few more resources, again, all of which are linked or on the collaborative worksheet. One is that our work with Every Learner Everywhere, they have a lot of really great foundational resources. One is their 8 equity principles that offers a beautiful framing for inclusion in digital learning environments. And then they have a database of resources that includes playbooks, reports, and other assets, many of which OLC has created. They're completely free, and they can help to advance your efforts in quality and equitable online blended and digital learning. So I'm going to close with my aspirations for the future, and I'm going to invite you to share yours asynchronously. We have an activity that's primed for you to come back to later that you can complete asynchronously or maybe collaboratively with your colleagues who you choose to do a little bit of professional development after this by remixing this talk. But I'm going to close by ending with one more story, which is taking us back to where we started in Tokyo at the Digital Arts Museum. So though I was discouraged and lonely initially, I did make it through the one room that limited my mobility and made me question myself, soft black hole. And through the generosity of strangers and nonverbal communication, I realized that I was not alone, that I could call on others to help me. I actually did lean on some other people, but most importantly, that I was stronger than I'd felt in that moment. And through room after room, these feelings grew stronger and took me to a seemingly blocked room of giant plastic orbs, which is actually what you're looking at. Those are all giant orbs that were blocking my way. At first, I had tried to push my way through, but I was met with resistance by all of the other people doing the same, which rendered us all stuck within the room. It was then that I discovered that if I quickly connected with the people around me and I was making eye contact and I helped them to clear their path, my own path would clear before me. And I made it to the exit in this way, but I really relished that time and the work making new connections and new paths, that I stayed in the room longer just to help people out and to explore a little bit more. And it's where I found myself in this work as well, that I'd rather stay and commit to creating space for the empowerment of all of our learners, for all of us as educators, rather than just leave those opportunities behind. So with that, I thank each of you for listening to a little bit of my journey, for sharing your own journey, and know that I honor each of your unique paths that you continue to make by walking. Thank you so much.
But we were just so honored to really have you here today, Angela, and we hope that we get to work with you more in the future. Definitely. It has been wonderful having you with us today. So I just want to give you another round of applause from all of us here with the Active Learning Academy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.